since several of my previous essays have been linked to Rand's moral condemnation of Immanuel Kant, 1724–1802, especially her infamous remark that Kant was the most evil man in mankind's history, The Objectivist, September
1971, I thought I would write a conciliatory essay or two about the moral and political theory of this villainous character whose evil supposedly exceeded that of the most murderous dictators in history.
The source of direct quotations from Kant are indicated by initials. See the conclusion of this essay for bibliographic details.
My intention is not to defend Kant's moral theory. I have serious disagreements, but to summarize some of its important features in a sympathetic manner.
By this I mean that even though I reject the deontological, duty-centered, approach to ethics, I find Kant's moral theory at once fascinating and highly suggestive, containing ideas that can be modified and then incorporated into a teleological, goal-directed, approach to ethics.
Kant's first two major works on moral theory, Groundwork of the Metaphysic of Morals, 1785, and Critique of Practical Reason, 1788, might be described today as treatments of meta-ethics rather than of moral theory as many people understand that label.
They are meta-ethical in the sense that they are largely devoted to the meanings of moral terms, such as duty or obligation, an explanation of why we may say that ethical principles are rationally justifiable, and the proper methodology of moral reasoning. If these works offer little in the way of practical maxims, this is because they focus a good deal on Kant's categorical imperative, which is a purely formal principle without any specific material content.
The categorical imperative per se does not prescribe particular goals that people should or should not pursue.
Rather, it mandates that moral maxims and general principles must be universally applicable to every rational being before they can qualify as authentically moral in character.
As Kant wrote,
the categorical imperative, which as such only expresses what obligation is, reads, act according to a maxim which can, at the same time, be valid as a universal law. You must, therefore, begin by looking at the subjective principle of your action.
But to know whether this principle is also objectively valid, your reason must subject it to the test of conceiving yourself as giving universal law through this principle.
If your maxim qualifies for a giving of universal law, then it qualifies as objectively valid.
DV, P.
14.
In other words, the categorical imperative is a formal principle of universalizability, a fundamental test that normative maxims and principles must first pass before they can qualify as rationally justifiable.
When Kant spoke of a moral law, he was drawing an analogy between the categorical imperative and the physical laws of nature. Just as there are no exceptions to the physical laws of nature, so there should be no exceptions to this fundamental law of morality.
Here is how Robert J. Sullivan explained the point of the categorical imperative in his excellent book Immanuel Kant's Moral Theory, Cambridge, 1989, p.
165.
Kant calls this formula the supreme principle of morality because it obligates us to recognize and respect the right and obligation of every other person to choose and to act autonomously.
Since moral rules have the characteristic of universality, what is morally forbidden to one is forbidden to all, what is morally permissible for one is equally permissible for all, and what is morally obligatory for one is equally obligatory for all.
We may not claim to be exempt from obligations to which we hold others, nor may we claim permissions we are unwilling to extend to everyone else.
In Causality versus Duty, reprinted in Philosophy Who Needs It, Ayn Rand launched an all-out assault on the concept of duty, calling it one of the most destructive anti-concepts in the history of moral philosophy. She objected to the common practice of using duty and obligation interchangeably, explaining what she regarded as significant differences and making some excellent points along the way.
It should be understood, however, that Kant did not draw this distinction.
For him, duty and moral obligation are synonymous terms, so if the term duty jars you while reading Kant, simply substitute moral obligation and you will understand his meaning.
I regard Causality versus Duty as an excellent essay overall, philosophically considered, but, predictably, Rand drags in Kant as a premier philosopher of duty and then distorts his ideas. Now, if one is going to use another philosopher as a target, one should at least make an honest and reasonable effort to depict the ideas of that philosopher accurately. But Rand shows no indication of having done this.
According to Rand, for example, the meaning of the term duty is the moral necessity to perform certain actions for no reason other than obedience to some higher authority, without regard to any personal goal, motive, desire, or interest. The problem with Rand's definition of duty is not simply that it does not apply to Kant's conception of duty but that it directly contradicts it. Even a cursory reading of Kant's works on moral theory will reveal the central role that autonomy played in his approach.
By autonomy, Kant meant the self-legislating will of every rational agent, and by this he meant, in effect, that we must judge every moral principle with our own reason and never accept the moral judgments of others, not even God, without rational justification.
Rand's claim that duty, according to Kant, means obedience to some higher authority is not only wrong, it is fundamentally antithetical to Kant's conception of ethics.
This is clear in the opening paragraph of what is probably Kant's best-known essay, An Answer to the Question, What is Enlightenment?
Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity.
Immaturity is the inability to use one's understanding without guidance from another.
This immaturity is self-imposed when its cause lies not in lack of understanding, but in lack of resolve and courage to use it without guidance from another.
Saprade.
Have courage to use your own understanding. That is the motto of the Enlightenment.
We, p.
Some of Rand's statements about Kant are largely accurate, as we see in this passage.
Duty, he holds, is the only standard of virtue, but virtue is not its own reward. If a reward is involved, it is no longer virtue.
The only motivation, he holds, is devotion to duty for duty's sake. Only an action motivated exclusively by such devotion is a moral action, i.e., performed without any concern for inclination, desire, or self-interest.
Kant believed that moral virtue will make one worthy of happiness and thereby foster a sense of what Kant called self-esteem. Curiously perhaps, in Galt's speech Rand used the same phrase, worthy of happiness, in relation to self-esteem.
But Rand was correct insofar as Kant denied that these and other possible consequences should constitute the motive of one's actions.
Kant held that we should follow the dictates of duty unconditionally, that is, without regard for the consequences of our actions, whether for ourselves or others.
A major problem with Rand's treatment of Kant in Causality versus Duty is she harps on his defense of moral duty without ever mentioning the categorical imperative, which is the centerpiece of Kant's moral philosophy.
As we have seen, the categorical imperative is not some nefarious demand that we obey the dictates of God, society, or government. Rather, it is a purely formal requirement that all moral principles must be universalizable. The categorical imperative is a dictate of reason that our moral principles be consistent, in the sense that what is right or wrong for me must also be right or wrong for everyone else in similar circumstances.
Kant is often credited with three basic formulations of the categorical imperative, but he framed the principle differently in different works, and one Kantian scholar has estimated that we find as many as 20 different formulations in his collected writings.
There are many such problems in Kant's writings, and these have led to somewhat different interpretations of the categorical imperative, as we find in hundreds of critical commentaries written about Kant.
Although I am familiar with all of Kant's major writings on ethics, I do not qualify as a Kantian scholar, so I do not feel competent to take a stand on which particular interpretation is correct.
But his basic point is clear enough, and it was nothing less than philosophical malpractice for Ayn Rand to jump all over Kant's defense of duty, or moral obligation, without explaining his categorical imperative.
Indeed, to my knowledge Rand mentioned the categorical imperative only once in her published writings.
In For the New Intellectual, she claimed that Kant's categorical imperative makes itself known by means of a feeling, as a special sense of duty. This is absolutely false, a claim that Kant protested against explicitly.
He insisted that the duty to follow the categorical imperative, i.e., our moral obligation to apply moral judgments universally and consistently, is a logical implication of our practical reason, not a feeling at all.
I shall go into greater detail about Kant's categorical imperative, especially its political implications, in my next essay, but before drawing this essay to a close I wish to make a few brief observations about Kant's attitude toward happiness.
From reading Ayn Rand, Leonard Peikoff, or some other objectivist philosophers on Kant, one can easily come away with the notion that Kant was a champion of selflessness, altruism, or perhaps something even worse.
This misleading interpretation is based on Kant's argument that moral actions should not be motivated by a desire.